The dinner changed everything, though not in the way the humans expected. When the meal ended and the delegates returned to their ships, Grace thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. The hardest part was just beginning. The next morning, Admiral Kovash convened an emergency session. The tone was different from before, quieter and more thoughtful, but the suspicion had not disappeared entirely. Some delegates still believed the humans were playing a game they could not understand. Gorthek spoke first. "We have considered the events of yesterday. The food was appreciated. But we must ask what the humans want in return. Nothing is given freely in this galaxy. There is always a price." Grace did to respond. "There is no price. We offer to share what we have learned. Salvage coordinates, growing techniques, universal recipes. All of it freely given." "Impossible," the Zelkari delegate said. "Knowledge is power. Resources are power. Why would any species give these things away? Because hoarding them doesn't help anyone." Grace looked around the table at faces still marked by distrust. "We're all stuck here together. If your ships starve, what happens to the fleet? If your children die, who will help us when the next crisis comes? We're not being generous. We're being practical." The debate continued for hours. Some delegates argued that accepting human help would create dependency. Others worried about contamination of their food supplies or cultural practices. The Netheri, who had walked out the day before, sent a message saying they would observe but not participate. But slowly, gradually, the resistance began to crack. It started with the young ones. Keleth brought a group of junior Velthari officers to the Steadfast, eager to learn how the growing chambers worked. Kevin Burke welcomed them with open arms, explaining each system in detail, answering every question with patience. By the end of the day, they were planting seeds of their own. A Metheny scientist named Trilith contacted Dr. Linda Park, fascinated by her research on universal nutrition. Together, they began mapping the dietary overlap between species, discovering connections that neither would have found alone. Trilith's crystalline mind processed data with remarkable speed, while Linda's human intuition made leaps that surprised them both. Even the Torvin came around, though they needed a different approach. Paula Hayes met with their engineering team to discuss salvage operations. The Torvin were warriors, proud and fierce, but they respected competence. When Paula showed them her shuttle's efficiency ratings and recovery percentages, they stopped seeing her as a small human female and started seeing her as a fellow professional. "You take risks," their lead engineer admitted grudgingly. "Your people do not fear the debris field." "We fear it," Paula corrected. "We just fear sitting still more." The Torvin understood this. They began sending their own teams into the debris field, sometimes working alongside human crews, sometimes on independent runs. Within a week, the combined salvage operations had recovered more supplies than anyone had thought possible. Danny Coleman became the unlikely center of it all. His kitchen on the Steadfast transformed into a culinary school, with alien chefs from 5 species crowding around his stove to learn the secrets of universal cooking. He taught them to think differently about food, to see meals as connections rather than just sustenance. A young Zelkari named Chittik was his most devoted student. Her species had always eaten alone, consuming their nutrient pastes in private chambers. The idea of shared meals was alien to her in the most literal sense. But something about Danny's approach captivated her. "Why do humans eat together?" she asked one day, watching him prepare bread for a class of 12 different species. Danny considered the question. "Because food tastes better when you share it. Because conversations happen easier around the table. Because when you break bread with someone, they stop being a stranger and start being a friend." Chittik's antennae twitched thoughtfully. "We do not have friends. We have Hive and we have others. There is no in-between." "Maybe there could be," Danny suggested gently. Maybe that's what all this is about. Building something in between. Finding common ground. Admiral Kovesh visited the Steadfast on day 23. He came without ceremony, almost sneaking aboard, and found Captain Martinez in the mess hall, sharing a meal with crew members from 4 different species. May I join you? The Admiral asked. Martinez gestured to an empty seat. Pull up a chair. Danny made something special today. Kovesh sat down among beings he would never have imagined sharing food with a month ago. He ate the universal bread, tasted vegetables grown in an impossible garden, and listened to conversations in 6 different languages mixing together into something like harmony. Afterward, he asked to speak with Martinez privately. They walked to the observation deck, where stars drifted past the windows in silent beauty. I have commanded fleets for 40 years, Kovesh said. I have studied the strategies of 100 species. I thought I understood how civilizations survive. He paused, his 4 eyes fixed on the void outside. I did not understand the human recipe. The human recipe? Yes. Kovesh turned to face the captain. When resources grow scarce, most species turn inward. They protect what they have. They calculate who deserves to survive and who can be sacrificed. It is logical. It is practical. It is how my people have operated for thousands of years. He shook his head slowly. But your people do the opposite. When facing scarcity, you create abundance. When facing division, you build connection. You share knowledge instead of hoarding it. You work without being ordered. You help without expecting payment. He paused. This is not logical. It is not practical. And yet it works. Martinez smiled. It doesn't always work. We've had our share of failures. Times when fear won out over cooperation. Times when we turned on each other instead of coming together. But you keep trying. We keep trying, Martinez agreed. Because the alternative is giving up. And humans are really bad at giving up. The rescue fleet arrived on day 37. By then, the Allied fleet had transformed. 3 ships had converted cargo bays to growing chambers using techniques learned from Kevin Burke. Salvage operations had recovered enough supplies to feed everyone for months beyond the rescue date. Danny's universal recipes had been translated into 6 languages and distributed to every galley in the fleet. More importantly, something had changed in how the species related to each other. The daily council meetings had evolved from arguments about division into discussions about cooperation. Joint projects were proposed. Cultural exchanges were planned. The Corvin Accords, drafted in the final days before rescue, included provisions for shared resource development and human-style emergency protocols. On the last day before the fleet separated, Danny Coleman stood in his kitchen teaching one final class. Beings from every species crowded around his stove, watching him demonstrate how to bake the bread that had started it all. A young Zelkari raised her hand. It was Shiddick, who had gone from cautious observer to enthusiastic cook over the past weeks. "Teacher Danny," she said, using the title the aliens had adopted for him. "I have a question. Go ahead. Why do humans share their secrets so easily? On my world, knowledge is guarded. Recipes are family treasures passed down through generations. You have given us everything in a few weeks. Why?" Danny finished kneading the dough and set it aside to rise. He wiped his hands on his apron and looked at the collection of strange and wonderful beings who had become his students. "Because food is better when you share it," he said. "Because recipes are better when they spread. Because the whole point of cooking is to bring people together. And you can't do that if you're keeping secrets." He smiled, the same warm smile he had worn since the first day of the crisis. "That's not a human secret. It's a human truth. And now it's yours too." The class ended. The students dispersed. The fleet separated, and went its different ways across the galaxy, carrying with them seeds and recipes and something more valuable than either. They carried hope. They carried proof that abundance could be created where scarcity had ruled. They carried the memory of a moment when 7 species sat down together and shared a meal. They carried the human recipe. And wherever they went, they would spread it further. Danny Coleman returned to his kitchen, cleaned his tools, and started preparing for the next meal. There was always another meal to make, another table to set, another chance to turn strangers into friends. That was the human way. That was his way, and it was just getting started. The council chamber had become a battlefield without weapons. Day 12 of the crisis, and the alliance that had once united 7 species against a common enemy was crumbling. Grace Perry sat in her usual spot at the end of the table and watched it happen. The Torvan commander, a scarred veteran named Gorthik, was on his feet. His scales had darkened with anger, a sign that even the translator devices could not hide. "We will not accept these terms," he growled. "My soldiers fought and died to protect this fleet. They will not be reduced to half rations while others eat their fill. If the council cannot treat us fairly, we will take what we need. Threats will not solve our problems," Admiral Kovesh replied, his 4 eyes fixed on the Torvan. "We must remain united." "Unity means nothing to the hungry," Gorthik shot back. "Words do not fill stomachs." The Zelkari delegate's wings buzzed with agitation. "Perhaps if your soldiers had fought better, we would not be in this situation. The Torvan fleet took the heaviest losses because of poor tactical decisions. Why should the rest of us suffer for your failures?" The chamber erupted. Accusations flew in 6 different languages. The Nathiri delegation rose and walked out entirely, declaring that they would handle their own supplies and wanted nothing more to do with the council. The Qureshi twins clutched each other and spoke in rapid whispers, clearly terrified. Grace checked her communicator. The message she had been waiting for had arrived. 2 words from Captain Martinez. "We're ready." She stood up from her seat. Nobody noticed. They were too busy shouting at each other. She walked to the main doors of the chamber and opened them. Then she stepped aside. Danny Coleman walked in pushing a hover cart. The cart was loaded with food. Real food. Fresh food. The smell of it preceded him into the room. Warm bread and roasted vegetables and something sweet that made every nose in the chamber turn toward the door. Behind Danny came Kevin Burke carrying baskets of green vegetables, their leaves still crisp and bright. Behind Kevin came Paula Hayes with containers of preserved goods. Behind Paula came Dr. Linda Park with bottles of water and purified juice. Behind Linda came Tony Reeves, still moving carefully from his injuries, but insisting on being part of this moment. Behind them all came Kelleth, the young Velthari observer, carrying a tray of the universal bread that he had helped bake the night before. The chamber fell silent. Admiral Kovesh stared at the procession. His translator device activated, but no words came out. He had nothing to say. Danny Coleman reached the center of the room and began setting up. He moved with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, arranging dishes, uncovering platters, filling the air with the aroma of abundance. "Good afternoon," he said, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. "I hope everyone's hungry. We made enough for the whole council, and there's more where this came from." Shirath, the Methany delegate, found her voice first. "What is this? Where did this food come from?" "From the debris field, mostly," Paula answered, setting down her containers. "Salvage operations. There's a lot of good stuff floating out there if you know where to look. We've recovered enough preserved supplies to extend rationing by weeks. From our gardens," Kevin added, displaying his baskets. "Accelerated growing techniques. These vegetables were seeds 10 days ago. We've got 2 more harvests coming, and we're expanding production every day. And from my kitchen, Danny said, placing the final dish on the table, I've been working on recipes that multiple species can share. This bread, for example. Humans, Volferi, Kureishi, Zelkari, and Metheny can all eat it. Same loaf. Same meal. He lifted one more cover, revealing a small but beautiful chocolate cake. And this is for everyone. Every single species in this room. Dessert. Because you can't have dinner without something sweet to finish. The delegates stared at the food. Some reached out tentatively, as if expecting it to vanish like a mirage. Others remained frozen, unable to process what they were seeing. Gorthik, the Torvan commander, broke the silence. This is a trick. Some kind of manipulation. You have been hoarding while we argued. Grace stepped forward. She had been silent in these meetings for 12 days. Now she spoke, and her voice carried across the chamber. No trick. No manipulation. No hoarding. Everything you see here was created in the last 12 days. Salvaged, grown, and cooked by the crew of one small human ship. She paused, letting the words sink in. While this council debated how to divide what we had, my people were working on how to make more. Why? Sharath asked. Why would you do this? Because it needed to be done, Grace replied simply. Because we could. Because sitting around calculating who deserves to starve is not something humans are willing to do. When we see a problem, we try to solve it. That's who we are. Admiral Kovesh finally found his words. You should have informed the council. You should have sought permission, coordinated with our supply officers, followed proper protocols. Would you have said yes? The Admiral hesitated. The answer was obvious to everyone in the room. You never asked what we could do, Grace continued. You only asked what we wanted. From the first day, every discussion has been about division. Who gets more? Who gets less? Who deserves priority? Nobody once asked if there was another way. She gestured to the food spread across the table. This is another way, and we're not keeping it to ourselves. Everything we've learned, every technique we've developed, we'll share with anyone who wants to learn. The salvage coordinates, the growing methods, the universal recipes, all of it. Danny Coleman picked up a knife and began slicing the bread. Now, who wants to eat? We've got plenty, and it tastes better warm. For a long moment, nobody moved. The delegates looked at each other, at the food, at the humans who had just overturned everything they thought they knew about survival and scarcity. Then Kelleth stepped forward. The young Velthari took a piece of bread and bit into it. His eyes closed briefly as he chewed. It's good, he said softly. It's really good. That broke the spell. The Kureishi twins approached together, selecting vegetables they recognized. The Zelkari delegate's wings stopped buzzing as she examined the dishes that had been prepared for her species. Even Gorthik, the angry Torvan commander, reached for a piece of bread and sniffed it cautiously before taking a bite. Admiral Kovesh stood apart, watching his council transform. They had entered this chamber ready to tear the alliance apart over diminishing rations. Now they were sharing a meal that none of them had expected, created by a species most of them barely noticed. Grace approached him quietly. This doesn't solve everything. We're still stranded. We still need to be rescued. But nobody has to starve. Nobody has to fight over crumbs. There's enough, if we work together to create it. The Admiral looked at her with new eyes. Why do your people think this way? What makes you different? Grace considered the question. It was one she had asked herself many times since first contact 15 years ago. I'm not sure we are different, she finally said. Maybe we just haven't learned yet that problems can't be solved. We keep trying because nobody told us to stop. Danny Coleman appeared beside them, holding 2 plates. Admiral, "Lieutenant Commander, you should eat something. Long day ahead." Grace took her plate and smiled at the chef who had turned a crisis into a feast. Around them, the council chamber had become something it had never been before. A dining room. A place where enemies became guests and scarcity gave way to sharing. It was not yet peace, but it was a beginning. Caliph had been assigned to observe the humans as a punishment. At least, that was how he understood it. He was young for a Veltari officer, barely past his coming-of-age ceremonies, and he had made the mistake of questioning a senior commander's tactical decision during the battle. Now he was stationed aboard the smallest, least significant vessel in the fleet, watching a species that most of his people considered primitive. He expected to be bored. He expected to write dull reports about human inefficiency and send them to Admiral Kovesh, who would ignore them entirely. He expected to count the days until he could return to a proper Veltari ship and resume his career. He did not expect to witness a miracle. The humans never stopped moving. That was the first thing Keleth noticed. On Veltari ships, crew members had designated rest periods that were strictly enforced. Sleep was essential for optimal performance. But the humans seemed to operate on a different principle. They rested when they could, worked when they had to, and never let a single hour go to waste. Caliph followed them through the ship, trying to understand what they were doing. He watched the salvage teams depart and return, their shuttles heavy with recovered supplies. He watched Kevin Burke tend his impossible garden, coaxing green life from metal trays under artificial light. He watched Danny Coleman in the kitchen, surrounded by ingredients and experiments, creating dishes that defied everything Caliph knew about species-specific nutrition. On day 8, he sent his first report to Admiral Kovesh. He described the salvage operations, the hydroponics project, the universal cooking experiments. He included data on the supplies recovered and the food produced. He concluded that the humans were attempting to solve the rationing crisis through production rather than distribution. The Admiral's response was dismissive. He wrote that Caliph was exaggerating, that no species shared food production knowledge freely, that the humans were probably just hoarding resources for themselves. He ordered Caliph to continue observing but to maintain realistic expectations. Caliph read the response and felt something shift inside him. He had spent his whole life trusting the wisdom of his superiors. Now, for the first time, he wondered if they might be wrong. He began spending more time with the humans. They accepted his presence without suspicion, even inviting him to join their meals. The food was strange but not unpleasant. More importantly, the company was unlike anything he had experienced before. "You're working very hard," he said to Paula Hayes one evening, watching her review salvage reports in the mess hall. "Why do you do this? Your ship's supplies are secure. You could simply wait for rescue like everyone else." Paula looked up from her datapad. She had dark circles under her eyes and grease stains on her uniform, but she smiled at him. "That's not really how we think about things. I do not understand. Okay, let me try to explain." Paula set down the datapad and leaned forward. "When I was a kid, there was a flood in my hometown. Bad one. Destroyed a lot of houses, including ours. We had to evacuate to a shelter with hundreds of other families. Food was limited, water was rationed, and everyone was scared." Caliph nodded. He understood disaster situations. They were common enough in the galaxy. Most people just sat there waiting for help, Paula continued. "But my mom, she got up the second morning and started organizing things. She figured out which families had skills we needed. She found a guy who knew how to fix the water purifiers and a woman who used to be a nurse. She got the teenagers cleaning up debris and the kids helping distribute meals. By the end of the week, we weren't just surviving. We were actually doing okay. Your mother sounds like an exceptional person." Paula smiled. She was ordinary. That's my point. She wasn't a leader or a hero. She was just someone who saw a problem and decided to do something about it instead of waiting for someone else. That's what humans do. We can't just sit still when there's work to be done. Kella thought about this for a long time. On Velthory ships, initiative was discouraged. Orders came from above, and following them was considered the highest virtue. The idea that ordinary individuals might take action on their own, without instruction or permission, was almost incomprehensible. Yet here were the humans, doing exactly that. He asked to help with the salvage operations. The humans seemed surprised but agreed. They gave him a suit and taught him how to use the cutting tools. They showed him how to identify valuable cargo and how to move safely through the debris field. They trusted him with their lives, this stranger from another species, simply because he had asked to contribute. The work was harder than anything Kelleth had ever done. His muscles ached, his eyes burned, and his suit accumulated scratches and dents that would have horrified his former commanders. But when the shuttle returned to the Steadfast with a full load of recovered supplies, he felt something he had never felt before. Pride. Not the pride of rank or achievement, but the pride of having helped. Of having mattered. He sent another report to Admiral Corvish. This one was longer and more detailed. He described not just what the humans were doing, but why they were doing it. He explained their philosophy of active problem-solving, their willingness to share resources and knowledge, their fundamental belief that working together was better than competing alone. The Admiral did not respond. On day 11, Danny Coleman invited Kelleth to the kitchen for a special preview. The chef had been working on something secret for the past 3 days, and he wanted to share it before the big reveal. "I call it universal bread," Danny said, pulling a warm loaf from the oven. 5 species can eat this. Humans, Velthory, Qurayshi, Zelkari, and Methany. Same loaf, same meal, same table. Kelleth stared at the bread. It was golden brown, perfectly formed, and it smelled incredible. This is not possible. Our nutritional requirements are completely different. Different, yes. Incompatible, no. Danny sliced off a piece and handed it to Kelleth. "Try it." The Velthory hesitated, then took a bite. The texture was unusual, slightly denser than what he was used to, but the flavor was warm and satisfying. He could feel his body accepting it, processing it, drawing energy from it. "This is remarkable," he whispered. Danny grinned. "That's just the appetizer. Wait until you see what I'm making for the main course." Kelleth helped in the kitchen that night, learning to knead dough and chop vegetables. He was clumsy at first, but Danny was patient, guiding his hands and explaining each step. By the end of the evening, Kelleth had contributed to a meal that would feed a dozen different beings. He returned to his quarters and sat in the darkness, thinking. Tomorrow, Grace Perry would attend another council meeting. Tomorrow, the delegates would continue arguing about how to divide diminishing resources. Tomorrow, the fleet would drift one day closer to starvation. But also tomorrow, the humans would be ready to show everyone another way. Kelleth made a decision. He would not just observe anymore. He would not just send reports that his superiors ignored. When the time came, he would stand with the humans and help them deliver their message. It was, he realized, the most human thing he had ever done. The council chamber aboard the Velthory flagship smelled like fear. Grace Perry could sense it the moment she stepped through the doors. 7 species had gathered around the curved table, their holographic displays glowing with the same terrible numbers. And every face showed the same expression: desperation. Fleet Admiral Corvish stood at the head of the table. He was tall for a Velthory, his blue-gray skin pulled tight over sharp bones, and his 4 eyes moved constantly across the assembled delegates. 3 weeks ago, he had commanded the greatest Allied fleet in galactic history. Now he commanded a collection of broken ships drifting in dead space, and everyone in this room knew it. Grace took her seat at the far end of the table. The human contingent was small, just one cruiser among dozens of larger vessels, and the other delegates barely glanced at her. She was used to this. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and most species still considered Earth a minor world with little to offer. The Metheny delegate rose to speak. Shirath was a crystalline being who caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across the walls. Beautiful to look at, but the words that came from the translation device at her base were ugly. "The calculations are complete," Shirath announced. "At current consumption rates, our combined food supplies will be exhausted in 18 days. Some species will face critical shortages even sooner. The Zelkari young require specialized nutrients that will run out in 12 days. The Torvan protein supplements will last only 14 days. We must begin rationing immediately." The chamber erupted. The Zelkari delegate, a small insectoid creature with wings that buzzed when agitated, demanded priority for their nursery ships. The Torvan commander, a massive humanoid covered in thick scales, slammed his fist on the table and declared that soldiers could not fight on empty stomachs. The Netheri representative spoke in rapid clicks about the sacred nature of their feeding rituals. Everyone talked. Nobody listened. Grace watched it all in silence. She had been trained in diplomacy, had spent years learning how to navigate between cultures and find common ground. But she saw no common ground here. Only 7 species looking at a shrinking pie and trying to grab the biggest slice. Admiral Korvash raised his hands for quiet. It took several minutes before the delegate settled down enough to hear him speak. "We have sent distress signals," Korvash said. "Rescue vessels are on their way, but the nearest fleet is 40 days out. We must survive until then. This means sacrifices. This means cooperation. This means we must decide together how to distribute what remains. Distribution means some will eat while others starve," the Torvan commander growled. "My soldiers protected this fleet during the battle. They bled for every ship in this chamber. They deserve full rations." "Your soldiers are not more valuable than our children," the Zelkari delegate replied, wings buzzing louder. "Without the young, our species has no future. They must be fed first. Perhaps we should calculate which species can survive longest on reduced intake," Shirath suggested. Her crystalline form pulsed with soft light. "The mathematics would be fair. Those who can endure hunger should accept smaller portions so that those who cannot may survive." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen this before, in history lessons about Earth's darkest times. When resources grew scarce, people stopped seeing each other as allies. They started calculating the value of lives. They started making lists of who deserved to survive and who could be sacrificed. It never ended well. She pulled out her communicator and sent a quiet message to the Steadfast, the human cruiser waiting 3 kilometers off the flagship's port side. The message was simple. It asked one question that none of the delegates in this chamber had thought to ask. What can we do about this? The arguments continued around her. The Netheri demanded that spiritual needs be considered alongside physical ones. The Koreshi, a species of symbiotic pairs, insisted that they could not be separated for individual rationing and must be counted as single units. The Velthari tried to maintain neutrality but clearly favored their own ships in every proposed distribution plan. Grace received a reply from Captain Leo Martinez. He had read her message to the crew. Ideas were already forming. He asked her to keep him updated on the Council's decisions while they explored options. She almost smiled. This was the difference, she realized. Every other species in this room was asking the same question. How do we divide what we have? Her people were asking a different question. How do we make more? The council session dragged on for hours. By the end, they had agreed on nothing except to meet again tomorrow. The Torvins stormed out, threatening to take supplies by force if their demands were not met. The Zelkari announced they would no longer share medical resources with species who voted against child priority. The Metheny calculated that if conflict broke out, total fleet casualties would exceed the starvation projections by 300%. Grace slipped away from the table while the others were still arguing. She made her way to the shuttle bay and caught a transport back to the Steadfast. The human cruiser looked small compared to the massive Velthari warships surrounding it, but as she approached, she saw lights blazing in compartments that should have been dark. Her crew was already working. She found Captain Martinez in the mess hall with a dozen crew members gathered around him. Paula Hayes, the chief engineer, was sketching something on a datapad. Kevin Burke from Hydroponics was talking excitedly about growth cycles. Danny Coleman, the ship's chef, was making notes about nutritional requirements. What did I miss? Grace asked. Martinez looked up with a tired smile. Your message started something. Paula pointed out that we're drifting near the debris field from the battle. Half those destroyed ships were cargo haulers. There might be salvageable supplies floating out there. And I've got emergency seed stores, Kevin added. Give me enough light and water. I can grow vegetables in 2 weeks using accelerated techniques. Maybe faster if I can boost the nutrients. Danny Coleman raised his hand. He was a heavy-set man with kind eyes, the sort of person who believed every problem could be solved with a good meal. I've been thinking about the food compatibility issue. Dr. Park and I went through the medical database. Turns out, 5 of the 7 allied species can eat a lot of the same basic foods with minor preparation changes. Everyone's been assuming we need completely separate supply lines, but that's not true. Grace felt the cold knot in her stomach begin to loosen. You're talking about creating food instead of rationing it. That's exactly what we're talking about, Martinez confirmed. The council can spend the next 18 days fighting over crumbs. We're going to spend it baking bread. Paula stood up, her datapad showing schematics of the debris field. I need volunteers for salvage runs. It's going to be dangerous work. Lots of unstable wreckage out there. Every hand in the room went up. Grace looked around at her crew, at these humans who responded to crisis not with fear, but with determination. Tomorrow, she would return to the council and listen to more arguments about who deserved to live. Tonight, she would help her people do what humans had always done best: find a way. The Steadfast had never been a quiet ship, but in the days following Grace's message, it became something else entirely. It became a factory, a laboratory, and a farm all at once. Crew members who normally worked separate shifts found themselves sharing meals at odd hours, trading ideas between bites, then rushing off to implement whatever solution they had just invented. Captain Leo Martinez stood on the observation deck and watched his people transform. He had commanded this ship for 3 years and thought he knew what his crew was capable of. He had been wrong. They were capable of so much more. Paula Hayes led the first salvage team into the debris field on day 2. The wreckage of the Battle of Corvin Drift stretched across thousands of kilometers, a graveyard of broken ships and scattered cargo. Most of the destroyed vessels had been warships, their holds empty of anything useful, but Paula had studied the battle reports carefully. She knew exactly which ships had been carrying supplies. The salvage shuttle moved slowly through the floating debris. Metal fragments pinged against the hull like rain on a roof. Paula sat at the controls, while Tony Reeves and 3 other crew members suited up in the back. They would have to go outside, into the void, to retrieve anything worth keeping. Got something on sensors, Paula announced. Looks like a cargo container. Markings suggest it came from the colony transport Wandering Star. She was carrying agricultural supplies when she went down. Tony sealed his helmet and gave her a thumbs up. Let's go shopping. The work was dangerous. Debris shifted without warning. Sharp edges could tear through suits and skin alike. But the humans moved with practiced efficiency, tethering themselves together, watching out for each other, calling out hazards before they became emergencies. Tony found the cargo container wedged between two pieces of hull plating. The seal was intact. When he cut through the outer casing and pried open the door, he found row after row of preserved food containers, seed packets, and water purification tablets. Enough to feed 100 people for a week. "First catch of the day," he reported back to the shuttle. "Let's keep fishing." Back on the Steadfast, Kevin Burke had transformed Cargo Bay 4 into something nobody had ever seen on a military vessel. Grow lights hung from the ceiling, casting artificial sunlight on rows of planting trays. Water recycling systems hummed in the corners, filtering and purifying the same liquid over and over again. Seeds that had been stored for emergency colonization were now sprouting in neat green rows. Kevin walked between the trays with a scanner, checking nutrient levels and growth rates. He had grown up in an agricultural world, had spent his childhood elbow-deep in soil, and he brought that knowledge to bear now. These were not natural growing conditions, but he would make them work. "The lettuce will be ready in 8 days," he told Dr. Linda Park, who had come to observe. "Radishes in 6. I'm experimenting with some accelerated growth compounds we salvaged yesterday. If they work, I might be able to cut those times in half." Linda made notes on her datapad. She was not a botanist, but she understood nutrition. More importantly, she understood alien nutrition. Her research into the dietary needs of the allied species had revealed something surprising. 5 of the 7 species in this fleet can digest plant cellulose, she explained. The Velthari, the Methani, the Zelkari, the Koreshi, and humans. We've all been maintaining separate food supplies because that's tradition, but there's no biological reason for it. If we prepare the vegetables correctly, we can feed half the fleet from the same garden. Kevin grinned. "Tell me what they need. I'll grow it." In the ship's kitchen, Danny Coleman was conducting experiments of his own. The counters were covered with ingredients, cooking tools, and pages of notes. He had not slept in 2 days, but his eyes were bright with excitement. Danny had spent his whole career feeding humans. Now he was teaching himself to feed everyone. "The trick is finding common ground," he explained to his assistant, a young woman named Beth, who had volunteered to help. "Every species has things they can't eat, things that would make them sick or worse. But there's overlap. You just have to find it." He pulled a tray from the oven. On it sat a loaf of bread, golden brown and steaming. It looked like ordinary bread, but it was anything but ordinary. "Modified wheat flour," Danny said, slicing off a piece. "I replaced about 30% with a processed grain from the salvage haul. It's something the Koreshi consider a staple. Nutritionally, it works for them and for us. Taste-wise, it's actually pretty good." Beth tried a bite. Her eyes widened. "This is delicious. Now, I just have to figure out how to make it work for the Zelkari, too. Their digestion is trickier, but I've got some ideas." The days blurred together. Salvage teams made run after run into the debris field, bringing back supplies that everyone had assumed were lost. Kevin's garden grew faster than anyone expected, green life pushing up through artificial soil. Danny's experiments produced a growing list of recipes that multiple species could share. Grace continued attending the council meetings. She said little, took notes, and watched the other delegates spiral deeper into conflict. The Torvin had begun posting guards outside their supply holds. The Zelkari had stopped speaking to the Netheri entirely. Every session ended in shouting Dodd. She sent reports back to Captain Martinez after each meeting. His replies were always the same. "Keep watching. We're almost ready." On day 10, something happened that nearly derailed everything. Tony Reeves was working in a particularly unstable section of the debris field when the hull fragment he was standing on shifted. One moment he was cutting open a storage locker. The next he was pinned beneath a massive piece of metal, his suit alarms screaming warnings about pressure loss. The other salvage team members reacted instantly. Paula brought the shovel in as close as she dared, while two crew members made their way to Tony's position. They worked together to lift the debris, straining against the weight, even in zero gravity, refusing to leave their friend behind. They pulled Tony free with seconds to spare. His suit was damaged but intact. He was bruised and shaken but alive. "That was too close," Paula said as they helped him back to the shuttle. Tony managed a weak laugh. "Worth it, though. Did you see what was in that locker? Cocoa powder. 50 kilograms of it." Paula stared at him. "You almost died for chocolate." "Not just chocolate," Tony replied. "Danny's been looking for something to make dessert. Something every species can enjoy together. Now he's got it." The shuttle returned to the Steadfast with its precious cargo. Tony went to medical for observation, while Paula delivered the cocoa powder to Danny personally. The chef held the container like it was made of gold. "Do you know what this means?" he asked, his voice hushed with wonder. Paula shook her head. Danny smiled. "It means we're not just going to feed them. We're going to give them something to celebrate."